February 19, 1942. On this day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which authorized military commanders to remove civilians from military areas. Though it did not specify an ethnic group, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt of the Western Defense Command issued Public Proclamation No. 4 on March 29, 1942, which began the forced evacuation and detention of Japanese Americans. The incarceration of Japanese Americans at Minidoka was not simply a reaction to the shock of Pearl Harbor, but the result of pre-existing racial prejudice intensified by wartime fear and political decisions. Although later reform through the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 acknowledged these injustices, the decades-long delay reveals how easily civil liberties can be suspended during times of national crisis. Many at the time voiced their view on the matter, with Colonel Carl Benson stating, "I am determined that if they have one drop of Japanese blood in them, they must go to camp." First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in her December 16th My Day column, "The great mass of our people, stemming from these various national ties, must not feel that they suddenly cease to be Americans." By the time it was August 1942, approximately 112,000 Japanese American immigrants had been sent to assembly centers where they waited and were tagged to show the location of where their long-term relocation would be for the rest of the war. They were only allowed to bring what they could carry and were forced to sell their property at massive losses, losing homes, farms, and businesses. The property that was left behind was vandalized, looted, or confiscated for unpaid taxes. Between 1942 and 1945, 10 camps were opened in California, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, and Arkansas. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards. One of these camps was Minidoka, located in Idaho. But what was Minidoka a reaction to? When the Second World War started in 1939, the United States had decided to remain out of the conflict, but one day would change their views in history forever. December 7, 1941, at 7:55 a.m. on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, the attack on Pearl Harbor began. The entire attack lasted around 75 minutes, killed 2,403 Americans, and wounded 1,178 Americans. The attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese led to a shift in opinion in the United States, from wanting nothing to do with the war to a mix of fear, anger, and a readiness to go to war. The next day, on December 8th, the U.S. declared war on Japan.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
This was a sudden and dramatic shift in the way the war was viewed, as well as Japanese American citizens. Pearl Harbor led to a fear in America that anyone who was Japanese was a threat and dangerous. The reaction in response to this fear was Japanese American incarceration. There had also been racial prejudice towards Japanese Americans, which also led to their incarceration. From 1924 to 1952, first-generation Japanese immigrants were not allowed to naturalize or become citizens in the U.S. Furthermore, the success of Japanese businesses led to many claiming they were a threat to white labor, and many states starting to call for legislation against Japanese immigrants. Minidoka opened on August 10, 1942, and remained in operation until October 28, 1945. The camp had a hospital, schools, a library, a fire station, stores, salons, and recreational areas. Though it was built to mimic a small town, the camp was surrounded by 5 miles of barbed wire fencing and had 8 watchtowers separating the camp from neighboring communities. I interviewed Dr. Roy Wesley, who was placed in the Minidoka internment camp when he was just a baby.
Our experience, my mom, my brother, and me, because I was born on the day that we were supposed to be sent into the camps, May 5th, 1942. And so that delayed our arrival into the Portland Assembly Center, which was the first unit that we were sent to, by 3 days. They gave my mom 3 days to recover in the hospital with me, and then we were transported to the Assembly Center and put into one of those 10-by-10 stalls.
The stalls at the Portland Assembly Center had been converted from an animal pen into a rough living quarter. Dr. Wesley's mom had had a rough time adjusting to the conditions right after giving birth.
And it was really pretty awful because it was spring, being in May. And so it was warm enough that the flies were still hatching in the manure that was underneath the plywood that covered the stalls for the animals.
On the train to Minidoka, Dr. Wesley's family huddled nearby each other for an uncomfortable 3 days and 2 nights as they traveled through eastern Oregon to south-central Idaho. Temperatures during the trip were in the 80s as they traveled through the desert. Once the family reached Minidoka on September 7th, they began their 506 days of imprisonment. Dr. Wesley also recalls times when the adults tried to make life in the camps feel as normal as possible.
I think they tried very hard to establish a normal lifestyle given the circumstances that they had. Christmas was a big event every year, and people would donate things for the kids to have as presents. My mom also found that there was a library nearby our barrack, and so she would get books out to read to my brother and me at night, and it was like she tried to keep a normal life for us as much as possible.
Japanese American citizens showed profound patriotism as over 33,000 from all 10 camps enlisted in the U.S. Army, with the highest number coming from Minidoka. In 1943, Eleanor Roosevelt visited a Japanese internment camp to show her opposition to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. By the time it was 1944, it was clear that a Japanese invasion was unlikely, which led to the closure of the camps. Many families who had been living in the camps were unable to recover from their loss of property and had to move. Dr. Wesley's family moved from Oregon to Chicago and were forced to start their lives over. In the 3 decades after World War II, Japanese Americans increasingly advocated due to the civil rights movement encouraging second-generation Japanese Americans to fight for both reparations and acknowledgement of the hardships their community faced during their incarceration. Proclamation 4417, titled An American Promise, was issued by President Gerald R. Ford on February 19, 1976. This document formally revoked Executive Order 9066 and included an official apology from President Ford stating, "We now know what we would have known then. Not only was that evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans." The next step of reform for Japanese Americans was the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, also known as the CWRIC. It investigated the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. The Japanese American Citizens League advocates for Japanese Americans by fighting discrimination, educating the public on Japanese American history, and lobbying for civil rights. They were a big part of the CWRIC being established. Dr. Wesley's father was part of the JACL.
He was president of the Portland chapter of the JACL, and at the time that Congress was looking at the possibility of not incarcerating the Japanese Americans, and so they had these committees set up along the West Coast, and one was in San Francisco, and my dad, being president of the Portland chapter of the JACL, went down to speak to them about why Japanese Americans should not be put into incarcerated camps.
The third and final step of reform was the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which gave surviving Japanese Americans who lived in the internment camps reparations and a formal apology from President Reagan for their incarceration. The act was signed into law on August 10, 1988 by President Ronald Reagan and applied the recommendations of the CWRIC. Although the act was signed into law, some lawmakers, including Daniel Lundgren, opposed it due to concerns over its cost and scope. Additionally, some first-generation Japanese immigrants opposed seeking reparations for their incarceration in World War II because they wanted to avoid reliving painful trauma and felt that constitutional rights could not be assigned a monetary value.
The people who really deserved reparations the most were the Issei's and my parents, who really suffered the brunt of all of the indignities, the removal, the loss of property. And of course, $10,000 at that time was just like a drop in the bucket to what they really lost significantly, and the emotional trauma that they experienced. So, I mean, yes, it was a nice gesture on the part of the government, and it took a long time for the people who were incarcerated to testify at Congress and tell their stories. But it's almost like it wasn't sufficient.
Pearl Harbor can be seen as a revolution because it overturned America's policy of isolationism. The response to Pearl Harbor was Japanese American incarceration. The reform to these events included the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and Proclamation 4417. Minidoka reveals that in times of crisis, fear can override constitutional rights. The incarceration of Japanese Americans demonstrates how quickly civil liberties can be suspended and how long it can take to restore them. Remembering Minidoka reminds us that history is not just about events, but also people, and the responsibility to ensure such events are never repeated again in history.